Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to 15th century Europe. A world of towering stone castles, candlelit halls, armored knights, cold winter mornings, and royal courts filled with luxury, ambition, and more political tension than anyone sleeping peacefully would ever want to deal with. So, before we begin, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let yourself slowly settle in. And if you enjoy these sleepy history journeys, consider subscribing. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see people from around the world drifting off together while exploring history. Now, imagine you are a young noblewoman in Europe around the year 1450. Perhaps you were raised inside a castle or a wealthy manor surrounded by tutors, servants, embroidery, religious instruction, and constant reminders about duty, reputation, and family honor. From childhood, people told you something important. Your life would likely never belong entirely to you. Your marriage, your future, and even your happiness might all serve political purposes larger than yourself. Then one day, everything changes. Your family receives extraordinary news. A king is seeking a bride, or perhaps a prince is ready to marry. Your name, somehow, has entered serious discussion. Suddenly, your household transforms. Relatives whisper behind doors. Servants move faster. Your mother begins inspecting dresses with frightening intensity. Your father becomes unusually polite. Even distant relatives who normally ignore you now seem deeply interested in your future. This is usually not a comforting sign. Before long, reality becomes clear. You may soon become queen. At first, this sounds like a fairy tale. After all, who wouldn't want to become queen? You would live inside magnificent castles filled with tapestries, jewels, silver goblets, roaring fireplaces, and lavish feasts. Nobles would bow, servants would obey. You would wear gowns stitched with silk, velvet, pearls, and gold thread. You would sit beside the king, dine with the most powerful people in the kingdom, and enjoy luxury beyond imagination. It sounds wonderful. Unfortunately, like many things in history, the glamorous version hides the exhausting truth. From a distance, becoming queen looks like a happy ending. Up close, it looks more like accepting one of the most stressful jobs in medieval Europe. Because once the crown touches your head, everyone suddenly becomes interested in everything you do. And by everyone, we mean everyone. Nobles watch you. Priests watch you. Foreign ambassadors watch you. Ladies-in-waiting watch you. The king's relatives watch you. Servants watch you. At some point, even the castle dog probably has political opinions about you. Nothing escapes attention. Wear the wrong gown to a feast, and people talk. Smile too warmly at the wrong noble, and people talk. Spend too much time with one advisor, and people talk. Fail to produce an heir, and people talk endlessly. Produce an heir, and people somehow talk even more. The ideal medieval queen was expected to be beautiful, graceful, intelligent, pious, fertile, charitable, politically useful, endlessly patient, and capable of navigating one of the most dangerous social environments imaginable. In other words, people expected perfection from someone living under constant pressure. Not stressful at all. The first harsh lesson of queenship was simple. Your marriage was rarely about romance. Yes, love existed in medieval Europe. Songs were written about it, poems celebrated it, and knights occasionally risked their lives for it. but royal marriage usually served politics first. Land, alliances, military support, peace treaties, legitimacy, succession, and power mattered far more than personal feelings. You were not just marrying a man, you were marrying a kingdom. That meant your relationship with the king carried enormous consequences. If the marriage strengthened alliances, great. If it created tension, problems followed. If you came from a foreign royal family, suspicion could become constant. Some courtiers might quietly wonder whether your loyalties truly belonged to your husband's kingdom or your family of birth. That is an uncomfortable way to start married life. And then there was court politics. Medieval royal courts were not calm places. They were beautiful, luxurious, and highly dangerous. Every noble family wanted influence. Every advisor wanted access. Every lord wanted royal favor. Wealth, titles, land, military command, tax privileges, and strategic marriages all depended on power. As queen, you immediately became part of this battlefield. People brought gifts. Compliments increased dramatically. Nobles praised your wisdom after meeting you for approximately 30 seconds. People laughed far too hard at jokes that were not especially funny. If someone declared you the most brilliant queen in Europe after one conversation, caution was advised. They almost certainly wanted something. And then there was the king's family. This deserves special attention, because if you think modern family drama can be complicated, imagine family tension combined with inheritance, crowns, military power, and entire kingdoms. Mothers-in-law became politically dangerous, brothers could become rivals, sisters formed alliances, cousins claimed influence, uncles developed suspicious ambition. Family dinners must have been fascinating, and by fascinating, we mean terrifying. One of the most exhausting responsibilities of a medieval queen was maintaining appearances. Royal life involved endless ceremonies, religious festivals, court banquets, diplomatic meetings, public celebrations, noble weddings, feast days, and church events filled the calendar. Every appearance mattered because monarchy relied heavily on image. The kingdom needed to see strength. The nobles needed to see stability. Foreign visitors needed to feel impressed. This meant your public life became carefully choreographed. Where you sat mattered. Who entered first mattered. Who you greeted first mattered. Who received your attention mattered. Even small gestures could gain political meaning. A smile could be interpreted as support. A cold expression could be interpreted as disapproval. A brief conversation might become gossip by morning. And gossip spread quickly, remarkably quickly. Medieval courts had no social media, yet somehow rumors traveled with shocking efficiency. A whisper in one corridor could become common discussion by dinner. A private disagreement could become public scandal before sunrise. Information moved through servants, nobles, guards, clerics, and visiting guests with astonishing speed. Privacy became rare, very rare. The castle itself might look magnificent from outside high stone walls. Banners flying, towers rising into the sky, but inside privacy was difficult. Servants entered rooms constantly. Ladies in waiting accompanied you. Guards remained nearby. Messengers delivered letters. Religious officials requested audiences. Even when alone, you were rarely truly alone. And then came the biggest source of pressure: heirs. No sooner had the wedding celebrations ended Then the kingdom began asking the same question. When will there be a child? Not eventually, not when you feel ready, as soon as possible. Because for a medieval queen, producing an heir was one of the most important responsibilities attached to the crown. A kingdom without clear succession invited chaos. Chaos invited war. War invited suffering. Stability depended heavily on children, preferably sons. This created intense pressure. Every month without pregnancy increased speculation. Every illness triggered rumors. Every private detail somehow became public interest. The future of the kingdom, apparently, had become everyone's business, no pressure at all. And if an heir finally arrived, celebrations exploded across the kingdom. Bells rang, feasts were held, prayers were offered. Nobles rejoiced because the future looked secure. For about 5 minutes, then people started worrying about the next problem. Because one child might die young, multiple sons might become rivals, brothers could fight for the throne. Powerful nobles could manipulate succession. History repeatedly proved that producing heirs solved some problems while creating entirely new ones. And perhaps that was the cruel irony of queenship. From outside, people saw silk gowns, jewels, crowns, and royal feasts. They saw glamour, they saw power, they saw privilege. What they rarely saw was exhaustion. The emotional exhaustion of constant performance, the mental exhaustion of endless caution, the physical exhaustion of ceremonies, pregnancies, childbirth, and relentless expectation, the psychological exhaustion of never fully knowing whom to trust, because beneath the gold and velvet, queens were still human. They felt fear, they felt loneliness, they felt uncertainty, and as you settle into castle life, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Becoming queen was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the real challenge. By now, you have survived the wedding, the coronation, the endless ceremonies, and the overwhelming realization that becoming queen was far less like a fairy tale and far more like accepting a lifetime appointment inside a beautifully decorated political battlefield. At this point, you might reasonably hope that once you settle into palace life, things become easier. Perhaps after a few months, everyone relaxes. Perhaps the nobles stop watching your every move. Perhaps the gossip slows down.
Perhaps the castle finally feels like home. Unfortunately, medieval courts were not known for becoming less complicated over time. If anything, the longer you remained queen, the more dangerous palace life became. The first reason was simple. Influence grows with familiarity. When you first arrived at court, you were new, inexperienced, and still learning the rules. That made you important, certainly, but limited your ability to shape major decisions.
Over time, however, that changed. You learned names, you understood alliances, you noticed which nobles always agreed with the king publicly, but complained privately. You learned which bishops held unusual political influence. You began noticing which advisors entered the king's chambers most frequently and which families somehow benefited from every royal decision. Slowly, the palace stopped feeling confusing and started becoming readable. And that is exactly when you became dangerous. Because a queen who understands the game can start playing it. That realization made many people nervous. A young, quiet queen might be manageable. A queen who understands politics, influences the king, builds alliances, and earns public respect becomes something else entirely. She becomes a power center, and power centers naturally attract both supporters and enemies. The more influence you gained, the more carefully others began watching you. Every friendship mattered more. Every conversation carried more weight. Every gesture could be interpreted politically. This is where palace smiles become deeply suspicious. One of the most exhausting realities of medieval court life was that hostility rarely announced itself openly. Very few people walked into your chamber and said, "Good morning, Your Majesty. I intend to destroy your reputation and replace your allies by winter." That would at least be honest. Instead, rivalry operated through whispers, favors, calculated kindness, strategic gifts, and carefully timed gossip. Everyone smiled, everyone bowed, everyone spoke politely. And beneath that politeness, countless invisible battles unfolded every day. Perhaps a noble woman begins praising another lady at court in front of you a little too enthusiastically. Perhaps a bishop subtly questions one of your charitable projects. Perhaps a trusted servant overhears strange conversations involving your name. At first, these things seem small. Individually, they may mean nothing. But court politics often worked like rain slowly soaking stone. No single drop seems important. Over time, the effects become impossible to ignore. One of the most dangerous sources of tension often came from older noble families. These were families who had served the crown for generations. They possessed land, wealth, military influence, and deep networks of loyalty. Some welcomed you warmly, others did not, especially if you came from another kingdom or another powerful house. Suspicion could remain for years. To them, you were not merely queen, you were an outsider with growing influence over the king, and outsiders with influence tend to make established elites uncomfortable. The king's mother could be especially complicated. History offers countless examples of queens struggling with mothers-in-law who had spent years shaping royal decisions before the new queen arrived. Imagine a woman who helped raise the king, advised him since childhood, and spent decades influencing court politics. Then suddenly you arrive and begin occupying the most important position beside him. Even if she personally liked you, the balance of influence changed. If she did not like you, things became considerably more stressful. And then there were the ladies-in-waiting. From the outside, ladies-in-waiting might seem like comforting companions. They dressed you, assisted with routines, accompanied you to ceremonies, helped manage daily life, and often remained physically close for long periods. Many queens genuinely formed deep bonds with these women. Some became trusted friends. Some became emotional support in an isolating environment. But this closeness also created vulnerability, because information lives where people live. The people closest to you knew your moods, routines, private frustrations, personal fears, and quiet conversations. If one of them became disloyal, intentionally or unintentionally, private details could spread rapidly. Privacy inside a medieval castle was almost mythical. Castles looked enormous from outside, with towers, gates, courtyards, and thick walls suggesting security and grandeur. But inside, true privacy was surprisingly difficult. Servants entered constantly. Fires needed tending, clothes needed maintaining, food arrived regularly, messages never stopped, guards remained nearby. Attendants moved through corridors at all hours. Even your private chamber rarely remained private for long. A queen could technically have personal space, but solitude was rare. Real solitude was rarer still. This meant emotional exhaustion became constant. Modern people often recover from stress through privacy, quiet, or stepping away from social pressure. Medieval queens had limited access to those luxuries. Even rest could feel performative. Even grief could become political. Even joy could be analyzed. If you laughed too freely with certain guests, people noticed. If you appeared too serious during celebrations, people noticed. If you withdrew for too long, people noticed. And once people noticed, people talked. The castle became an ecosystem of observation. Servants observed nobles, nobles observed rivals. Clergy observed morality. Ambassadors observed weakness. Everyone collected information because information meant advantage. That made trust one of the rarest resources in royal life. A queen constantly faced the same exhausting question: who is sincere, and who is performing loyalty for personal gain? This uncertainty extended even to friendships. Perhaps another noblewoman seems kind, intelligent, and supportive. She understands court life. She makes you laugh. She feels safe to confide in. But what happens if her family's interests conflict with yours? What happens if her husband seeks power the king refuses to grant? What happens if her brother joins a rival faction? Suddenly, personal bonds and political loyalties collide. This happened constantly. Relationships at court rarely stayed simple for long. And while palace politics already sounds exhausting, we have not yet discussed one of the most emotionally difficult challenges of queenship. Childbirth. Medieval childbirth was dangerous, extremely dangerous. Modern medicine has made many people forget how frightening childbirth historically was. In the 1400s, even wealthy women faced serious risk during pregnancy and delivery. Infection, blood loss, obstructed labor, and countless complications could turn childbirth deadly with terrifying speed. Queens had access to better care than ordinary people, certainly, but royal status did not grant immunity from biology. Now combine that physical danger with political pressure. A queen was not simply expected to bear children. She was expected to bear heirs. The kingdom's future depended on her body. Every pregnancy carried enormous public significance. Nobles prayed. Clergy offered blessings. Families calculated possibilities. Foreign kingdoms watched closely. If the child was male, celebration often exploded. If female, relief mixed with renewed pressure for a son. If pregnancy ended in tragedy, sorrow combined with fear about succession, this pressure could become crushing. Imagine being pregnant while the entire kingdom waits for news. Every symptom becomes discussed. Every physician's visit attracts attention. Every rumor spreads rapidly. You are not just carrying a child, you are carrying political stability. That is a truly unreasonable burden for any person. And even successful births did not end the anxiety. Children in medieval Europe faced high mortality. Illnesses that modern medicine easily manages could become deadly. Fevers, infections, respiratory illness, and childhood disease constantly threatened young lives. This meant queens lived with ongoing fear. Producing an heir was one challenge. Keeping that heir alive was another. Meanwhile, life at court continued relentlessly. Ceremonies continued. Religious duties continued. Diplomacy continued. Feasts continued. Political maneuvering continued. The kingdom did not pause simply because you felt exhausted, anxious, or overwhelmed. That may be one of the hardest truths about power. Responsibility rarely waits for emotional readiness. Perhaps this explains why some medieval queens became remarkably resilient. They had to. Survival required intelligence, patience, observation, and emotional control. A queen who reacted impulsively created vulnerability. A queen who mastered restraint gained strength. Learning when to speak, when to remain silent, when to forgive, and when to act became essential survival skills. But even the wisest queen could not control everything, because beyond the castle walls waited another source of terror: war. By now, you have survived marriage politics, endless ceremonies, palace rivalries, dangerous gossip, and the crushing pressure of producing heirs. At this point, you might hope that at least one category of stress remains outside your responsibility. Perhaps military matters belong entirely to the king. Perhaps war is something discussed by generals, knights, and nobles in armor, while you remain safely inside castle walls. Unfortunately, medieval queens rarely enjoyed that luxury, because even if you never held a sword in battle, war could transform every part of your life almost overnight. The first thing to understand about 15th century Europe is that peace was often temporary. Some kingdoms enjoyed long, stable periods, yes, but even during peace, conflict always felt possible. Borders shifted, alliances changed, nobles rebelled, claims to land were disputed, succession crises triggered wars. Because even if you never held a sword in battle, war could transform every part of your life almost overnight. The first thing to understand about 15th century Europe is that peace was often temporary. Some kingdoms enjoyed long, stable periods, yes, but even during peace, conflict always felt possible. Borders shifted, alliances changed, nobles rebelled, claims to land were disputed, succession crises triggered wars. Old rivalries never fully disappeared. Sometimes kingdoms spent decades pretending to tolerate one another while quietly preparing for future conflicts. In other words, peace often felt less like permanent stability and more like a short pause between arguments involving thousands of armed men. As queen, war mattered immediately because royal marriages themselves were often tools of diplomacy. Remember, your marriage likely helped secure alliances, land agreements, military support, or peace between powerful families. That meant, if conflict emerged, your identity could suddenly become politically complicated. Suppose you came from a neighboring kingdom. If war breaks out between your birth family and your husband's crown, where do loyalties lie? You may love your family. You may also now serve another kingdom. Suddenly, every letter you receive becomes suspicious. Every messenger raises questions. Every private conversation attracts attention. This placed queens in emotionally impossible positions. Imagine hearing that your brother now marches with an army against your husband's forces. Imagine knowing that victory for one side could mean devastation for people you love on the other. Medieval politics often forced personal relationships into brutal conflict with political duty. Love rarely simplified power. It usually complicated it. And then there was the terrifying possibility of siege. Modern people often underestimate how psychologically exhausting siege warfare was. When we imagine castles, we often picture grandeur stone towers, banners waving in the wind, great halls lit by fire, and armored knights guarding gates. Castles certainly projected strength. That was their purpose. But castles were also targets. And when enemies surrounded one, life inside could become deeply frightening. Imagine it is late at night, the castle sleeps. Torches burn low in the corridors. Wind brushes against stone walls. Servants rest in quiet corners. The great hall is dark. For a brief moment, everything feels calm. Then horns sound in the distance. Not festival horns, not hunting horns, war horns. The sound cuts through darkness like a blade. Immediately, everything changes. Guards rush to walls. Messengers sprint through corridors. Doors slam open. Servants wake in panic. Armor clatters. Horses scream in stables. The peaceful castle transforms into organized chaos within minutes. Somewhere beyond the walls, an enemy force has arrived. That moment alone could shatter sleep forever. Even before battle begins, the psychological weight of siege was immense. Castles offered protection, yes, but being trapped behind walls while enemies surround you creates a special kind of stress. You cannot leave safely. Supplies become precious. Every day becomes calculation. How much food remains, how much water, how loyal are the defenders? How long until reinforcements arrive? Will reinforcements arrive at all? As queen, your fear had to remain invisible. This is important. Royal image mattered most during crisis. Panic spreads quickly. If the queen appeared terrified, morale suffered. If the queen remained composed, others often steadied themselves. That meant, even when fear clawed at your chest, you were expected to project calm. You walked corridors reassuring servants, you supported children, you appeared before nobles with dignity. You prayed publicly, you embodied stability. Even while internally imagining worst-case scenarios, and sieges could last weeks, sometimes months, sometimes longer. That meant fear became routine. The first days might feel intense and dramatic. By week 3, exhaustion becomes another enemy. Food portions shrink. Tempers shorten. Rumors multiply. Tension spreads. Every small conflict feels bigger because nobody can escape. People who dislike each other must continue sharing confined space. Political factions do not disappear during siege. They often become worse because crisis reveals character. Some nobles become heroic under pressure, others become selfish. Some remain loyal, others begin calculating survival. If defeat seems possible, dangerous questions emerge. Who might negotiate surrender? Who might betray the castle? Who secretly believes resistance is hopeless? Once doubt enters a siege, trust begins collapsing, and betrayal from inside was often more dangerous than attack from outside. History repeatedly shows this. Strong walls mean little if someone opens a gate. That possibility haunted every ruler because castles were defended not just by stone, but by people. And people are complicated. Hunger changes behavior. Fear changes loyalty. Desperation creates temptation. A guard with starving children might accept bribes. A noble resentful of the king might secretly communicate with enemies. A servant might overhear plans and sell information. Again and again, we return to the same exhausting truth of royal life. The greatest dangers often came from nearby people, not distant enemies. Nearby ones, even without full siege, war still invaded daily life. Messages arrived constantly from battlefront. Reports from generals, requests for funds, casualty updates, diplomatic warnings, rumors of movement. Every messenger entering the castle could carry news powerful enough to reshape the kingdom. Imagine sitting at dinner when a mud-covered messenger arrives from the frontier. The hall goes silent. Everyone watches. Nobody breathes. The message is handed to the king. His expression changes. That single moment could tell you everything. Victory, defeat, rebellion. Invasion. Disaster, royal life could pivot in seconds. And if the king left for war personally, things became even more difficult. Many medieval kings fought directly. They led armies, commanded campaigns, and physically entered dangerous situations. That meant queens often remained behind managing royal responsibilities during absence. In some cases, queens acted almost like regents overseeing administration, finances, correspondence, and internal stability. Think about how exhausting that becomes. You already manage court politics. You already manage image. You already face pressure for heirs. Now your husband marches to war, and the kingdom expects you to help maintain order until he returns. If he returns, that last thought was often the most terrifying. War killed kings, not always, but often enough. Arrows do not care about crowns. Disease in military camps did not respect titles. Battlefield chaos spared no one reliably. A queen waiting in the castle often lived with unbearable uncertainty. Each day without news stretched endlessly. Each messenger created anxiety. Each prayer carried desperate hope. You might spend nights staring into candlelight, imagining battle scenes you cannot see but cannot stop picturing. Did he survive? Was he wounded? Was he captured? Is he already dead, while nobody here knows yet? Uncertainty is exhausting, and medieval communication was painfully slow. Today, people expect updates instantly. In the 1400s, news traveled at the speed of horses, ships, and human endurance. Delays were common. Messages were lost. Messengers died. Roads became dangerous. Weather interfered. This meant silence itself became terrifying. No news could mean nothing, or everything. Sometimes queens waited weeks with no reliable information. During that silence, rumor filled the gap. And rumor, as we already know, was one of the deadliest forces in medieval politics. Someone heard the king was injured. Someone heard the army retreated. Someone heard enemy forces crossed the river. Someone heard a major noble switched sides. Nobody knows what is true. Everybody talks anyway. This creates a brutal psychological environment. The human mind hates uncertainty and fills gaps with fear. A queen had to resist that instinct constantly. She needed composure while surrounded by chaos, fear, and speculation. But war created one more horror. Widowhood. Because every queen lived with the possibility that one day everything could end. One battle, one illness, one assassination, one failed campaign. That was all it could take. One day you are queen beside a living king. The next day you are widow to a dead one. And widowhood for a queen was not simply grief. It was danger. Enormous danger. Because when kings died, power shifted instantly. Succession questions exploded. Rival factions moved. Ambitious nobles acted quickly. Foreign powers observed weakness. Even if your son inherited the throne, if he was young, you entered a dangerous regency environment where everyone competed for influence. Suddenly, grief becomes political. You barely have time to mourn. People already calculate who controls the child king, who controls the army, who controls treasury, Who controls the Queen Mother? This is one of the cruelest realities of monarchy. Personal tragedy rarely remains personal. Loss becomes political almost immediately. Even tears may be analyzed. Was she genuinely devastated? Was she relieved? Who visited her chamber first? Who supports her now? Even grief became public theatre. And yet, despite all this, many queens proved astonishingly strong. Some ruled as regents. Some protected heirs. Some negotiated peace. Some outmaneuvered nobles. Some preserved dynasties during terrifying crises. History often focuses on kings and battles, but behind many stable kingdoms stood women performing extraordinary emotional and political labor. That labor rarely appears in paintings. Paintings show crowns, not stress. Paintings show silk, not sleepless nights. Paintings show ceremonies, not anxiety. But anxiety was always there, because every night, even after the feast ended and candles burned low, the queen carried countless invisible burdens. The burden of reputation, the burden of heirs, the burden of alliances, the burden of war, the burden of uncertainty, and, perhaps worst of all, the burden of never knowing when everything could change, because in medieval Europe, power was never fully secure, not even behind the strongest walls. By now, you have survived nearly everything medieval queens feared most. You have learned how to navigate ceremonies without making political mistakes. You have learned how to smile at people you do not trust. You have learned how to survive gossip, rivalry, childbirth, succession, anxiety, and the constant fear of war. At this point, you might begin thinking you finally understand royal life. You might even believe you have become strong enough to handle whatever comes next. And perhaps you have, but medieval monarchy still holds one final lesson, and it may be the cruelest lesson of all. Power is never truly yours. It only feels like yours until the day it disappears. This truth haunted every queen, whether she admitted it or not. Because beneath every jewel, beneath every silk gown, beneath every magnificent ceremony, there existed a terrifying reality. The crown could be taken away, not gradually, not politely, sometimes overnight. One evening you might dine beneath golden chandeliers, while nobles bow and musicians play softly in the hall. By morning, those same nobles might be kneeling before someone else. Political fortune in medieval Europe could change with astonishing speed. The terrifying part was how little warning sometimes existed. People imagine the fall of royalty as dramatic, with obvious warning signs, loud betrayals, and visible conspiracies. History suggests otherwise. Sometimes collapse arrived quietly, a few secret meetings, a few exchanged letters, a few shifting loyalties, a few promises made behind closed doors. Then suddenly, everything changed. A castle gate opened. Guards switched allegiance. A council declared support for another claimant. The army marched under a different banner. And just like that, your world fractured. Imagine waking before dawn to strange sounds outside your chamber. Not the familiar rhythm of servants preparing morning routines. Something different, more urgent, heavy footsteps, metal whispered voices, tension. Your ladies-in-waiting exchange nervous glances. A trusted servant enters. Pale-faced, he kneels. His voice shakes. Your Majesty, something is wrong. Those 5 words alone could freeze the blood. Because, in royal life, something is wrong rarely meant something small. It might mean rebellion. It might mean assassination. It might mean betrayal. It might mean the king is dead. And perhaps the most terrifying possibility of all, it might mean someone inside the palace has chosen a new ruler. This is what made betrayal so devastating. Foreign enemies were frightening, yes, but they lived outside your walls. Betrayal lived beside you. It shared meals with you. It bowed to you. It smiled at you. It congratulated your children. It kissed your hand during ceremonies. Then one day it turned. Many queens learned this lesson brutally. Take the Wars of the Roses in England, for example. 15th century England became one of the clearest demonstrations of how unstable monarchy could become. The conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York created decades of shifting alliances, betrayals, battles, and political reversals so frequent that keeping track of loyalties alone probably required a full-time scribe. One noble supports the king. Then he changes sides, then changes again. Marriages form alliances, alliances collapse. Brothers fight brothers, cousins fight cousins. Yesterday's ally becomes tomorrow's enemy. Now imagine trying to survive that as queen. Your safety depends on loyalty, loyalty depends on power, power depends on victory. Victory depends on people who may betray you. That is not a comforting equation. Queens often became central targets during political upheaval because removing a ruling family meant controlling not just the king, but the dynasty itself. Wives mattered, children mattered, heirs mattered, heirs mattered. Even infants could represent future threats because bloodlines carried legitimacy. This created horrifying situations where innocent children became political liabilities simply because of who their parents were. That reality gave medieval queens a unique kind of fear. Not only fear for themselves, fear for their children. A queen might accept personal danger with courage. Many did, but fear for children is different. Imagine hearing rebels approach while knowing your son, the future king, sleeps in another chamber. Suddenly, politics becomes intensely personal. Every decision becomes life or death. Do you flee, hide the children, trust the guards, negotiate, fight? Who remains loyal? Who already switched sides? Every second matters, and sometimes there were no good choices. The darkest truth of monarchy was that children inherited not only privilege but danger. A prince could become a symbol before understanding what symbols meant. He might be 5 years old and already dangerous to ambitious men simply because he carries legitimate royal blood. That sounds absurd until history reminds us it happened repeatedly. This made motherhood inside royal courts emotionally exhausting in ways ordinary people rarely imagine. A queen did not simply raise children. She raised targets. Precious, beloved, vulnerable targets surrounded by people calculating future power. Even education became political. Which tutors train the prince? Which noble families gain access? Which religious figures influence him? Which servants accompany him? Every person near an heir mattered because influence over children often became influence over future rulers. That is why regencies were especially dangerous. If a king died, leaving a child, heir chaos often followed. Officially, the child becomes king. In practice, adults fight to control him. Regents, nobles, military leaders, clergy, and royal relatives all claimed to act for the good of the realm. Sometimes they meant it. Sometimes they meant power. The Queen Mother often stood at the center of this storm. She might become protector of the heir. She might become regent. She might become obstacle that depended entirely on who wanted power. Some queens navigated this brilliantly. Others did not survive it. And this leads to another cruel irony of queenship. The skills that helped you gain influence could later make you dangerous in the eyes of others. If you were intelligent, politically aware, respected by the people, and close to the heir, rivals might fear you immensely. Your competence becomes threat. Your popularity becomes liability. Your survival becomes inconvenient. History repeatedly punishes powerful women for being too effective. That may sound unfair, because it was, and perhaps nothing illustrates this better than the experience of queens forced into exile. One of the most psychologically brutal outcomes of political defeat was not execution. It was exile. Execution ends quickly. Exile lingers. Imagine losing everything without dying. Yesterday you lived in heated chambers beneath tapestries and chandeliers. Servants dressed you. Nobles bowed. Messengers waited outside your door. Your voice shaped policy. Today you are escorted away under guard, carrying only what you were allowed to keep. The crown is gone. The throne is gone. Your title may technically remain, but its power has vanished. The silence would feel unbearable. No morning announcements, no court routine, no political meetings, no ceremonial duties. Just absence. And absence can hurt more than pain. For many queens, exile meant more than physical relocation. It meant identity collapse. If your entire adult life revolved around queenship, who are you without the court? Without influence, without duty, without the daily machinery of power surrounding you? That question could become devastating. And worse, exile rarely guaranteed safety. A living former queen remained politically useful to someone. That meant surveillance continued. Letters might be monitored, visitors restricted, allies punished. You might live comfortably compared to ordinary people, yet still remain a prisoner in all but name. And the cruelest part, many former allies vanished, because power attracts people. Losing power reveals people. That lesson may be one of the harshest in all of political history. When you sit beside the throne, everyone seems loyal. Lose the throne, and loyalty becomes measurable. Some stay, most disappear. If exile was cruel, there was something even more unsettling for many fallen queens. Being forgotten. At first, that might not sound especially terrifying. After all, after years of court politics, betrayal, endless ceremonies, and sleepless nights, perhaps being forgotten sounds peaceful. No more nobles begging for favor, no more bishops demanding support, no more endless political calculations, no more pretending to trust people who smile too much. On the surface, forgetting the court might sound almost comforting. But human identity is complicated, especially when that identity has been shaped by power for years. Imagine spending decades as the center of a kingdom's political universe. Every morning begins with messages. Every decision affects thousands. Every public appearance carries symbolic weight. Every word matters. You are constantly seen, constantly discussed, constantly needed. Even exhaustion becomes part of purpose. Then suddenly, silence. No one asks your opinion anymore. No one waits outside your chamber. No messengers arrive. No councils form around you. No ceremonies require your presence. The machine of power continues. It simply continues without you. That realization could be devastating, because one of monarchy's cruelest truths is this: kingdoms survive individuals. Kings die, queens fall, dynasties collapse, and still the world moves forward. The sun rises, church bells ring, markets open, children laugh, farmers work, merchants trade, life continues, with or without crowns. For a former queen, that realization could feel almost unreal. You once believed everything depended on your decisions. In many moments, perhaps it truly did. Yet time has a way of shrinking even enormous lives into memory. And memory is fragile. This may be the final burden of queenship. Not just ruling, not just surviving, but confronting impermanence. Even the greatest queens eventually faced it. Some lost power through rebellion, some through widowhood, some through political betrayal, some through age itself, because age introduced another reality royal portraits rarely show, growing old in a world obsessed with heirs and youth. This was especially difficult for queens because medieval society often tied female power heavily to fertility, beauty, marriage, and motherhood. A young queen producing heirs held obvious political value. An older queen beyond childbearing age could face changing influence depending on the stability of the dynasty. If sons ruled successfully, she might become respected matriarch. If succession remained uncertain, vulnerability returned. Aging also brought physical wear. We rarely think about how exhausting medieval luxury actually was. Those magnificent gowns, heavy, those jeweled crowns, heavy, those ceremonies lasting hours, physically draining, those cold stone castles, often uncomfortable. Winter inside castles could be brutal despite fireplaces. Drafts slipped through stone. Dampness lingered. Smoke from fires irritated lungs and eyes. Hygiene by modern standards remained difficult. Illness came often. Pain accumulated quietly. A queen in paintings appears radiant and timeless. Reality looked far more human. Tired feet, aching back, sleepless nights, headaches, fatigue, emotional scars, invisible beneath silk, because by old age, most queens had experienced tremendous loss. They lost parents, they lost friends, they lost children, they lost pregnancies, they lost allies, they lost certainty. Some lost husbands they loved. Others lost husbands they merely survived. Either way, loss remained constant. This is perhaps what makes historical queens so fascinating. Not simply the power they held, but the burden they carried. Take women like Margaret of Anjou. Take Elizabeth Woodville. Take Isabella of Castile. Take Anne Neville. Very different women. Very different stories. Yet all lived inside systems where intelligence alone was not enough. You needed resilience, emotional endurance, political instinct, and often sheer stubbornness, because medieval queens were never merely decorative figures sitting quietly beside kings. That is one of history's biggest misconceptions. Yes, some queens held limited formal authority, but influence is not always official. Influence lives in advice, in relationships, in diplomacy, in private conversations, In emotional intelligence, in understanding people, many queens shaped succession, foreign policy, court alliances, religious patronage, marriage negotiations, and dynastic survival. Some prevented wars, some helped start them, some stabilized kingdoms, some shattered them, some became beloved, some became feared, some became legends. And perhaps that is the strangest part of queenship. The same qualities that made a queen admirable could also make her dangerous. Intelligence could be called manipulation. Confidence could be called arrogance. Strength could be called ambition. Silence could be called coldness. Emotion could be called weakness. Women in power were judged constantly, often unfairly. Actually, not much has changed there. A queen had to perform impossible balance. Be strong, but not threatening. Be intelligent, but not controlling. Be influential, but not too influential. Be visible, but not attention-seeking. Be graceful, fertile, pious, diplomatic, patient, elegant, maternal, politically useful, emotionally composed, and endlessly dignified. In other words, be superhuman while remaining perfectly human. Not an easy job description. And maybe this brings us to the final question. After everything, was being a medieval queen worth it? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Of course, you lived in castles. You wore silk and velvet. You dined with kings. Nobles bowed when you entered rooms. You had wealth beyond ordinary imagination. You influenced the fate of kingdoms. You shaped history. That sounds extraordinary, and in many ways it was. But every privilege carried cost. The castle was magnificent. It was also a cage. The crown was beautiful. It was also heavy. Power was intoxicating. It was also dangerous. Luxury offered comfort. It did not guarantee peace. That may be the greatest irony of monarchy. The people who appeared to have everything often possessed the least security. A farmer's wife might live modestly. She worried about harvest, weather, hunger, illness. Hard life, very hard life, but she usually knew where she would sleep next month. A queen could not always say the same. One rebellion, one betrayal, one failed war, one succession crisis, one ambitious relative. Sometimes that was all it took. Everything could collapse, and yet, despite all of that, many queens left extraordinary legacies. They built monasteries, they funded churches, they supported education, they influenced diplomacy. They protected dynasties. They raised rulers. They changed history. Their enemies vanished. Their names remained. That tells you something important. Power alone does not create legacy. Survival shapes legacy. Resilience shapes legacy. The crown did not make these women extraordinary. Their ability to survive the crown did, so the next time you see a painting of a medieval queen wearing gold, pearls, and velvet, sitting gracefully beside a king beneath banners and candlelight, remember something. You are not just looking at luxury. You are looking at pressure. You are looking at calculation. You are looking at sacrifice. You are looking at someone who woke every morning inside one of the most demanding roles in medieval Europe. Someone who had to navigate ambition, rivalry, motherhood, diplomacy, war, and reputation, often all at once. And perhaps that is why being a medieval queen was so exhausting. From far away, it looked like a fairy tale. Up close, it felt more like carrying a crown made of gold and anxiety. And now, after surviving the court, the betrayals, the wars, the ceremonies, the rumors, and the impossible expectations, you finally get to do something many queens desperately wished they could do. Take off the crown, set it down, let the great hall fade into silence. Let the candles burn low, let the castle walls grow distant, and for the first time in a very long time, rest. Good night.